Okay, so have you ever felt that like urge to like scream no
Mm.
when someone asks you for like another favor?
Oh, yeah.
You're not alone.
Yeah.
We're going to dive deep into boundaries today, and we're using Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Tawwab to help us along the way.
This is a great book.
Yeah, and I think it'll be really helpful for us today as we kind of figure out what healthy boundaries look like, and how we can actually implement them in our own lives. And, her book is just full of like really great, um, just advice, and it's super practical, which I appreciate.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she goes beyond the surface level, right? A lot of people think of boundaries as just, like saying no, but she like digs into the why behind it.
You're so right. Yeah, it's not just about like shutting people out. It's about understanding why you're feeling resentful or overwhelmed or, maybe even burnt out. And she calls those feeling signs, like almost like your inner compass is pointing you towards an area where you need like a stronger boundary.
Totally. And like so many people feel like it's a personal feeling when they feel this way. And one of the biggest takeaways I think from her book is like realizing that that's not the case at all, actually.
Right.
And you are not doing something wrong for feeling that way. It's actually like a sign that you're neglecting yourself.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because she says, um, like all those traditional self-care things that we do, like, bubble baths and face masks and stuff. If you don't have solid boundaries in place, that can actually be like just a Band-Aid,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it's like you're constantly saying yes to everybody else's demands, and then you're like squeezing in these bubble baths as like another thing to do on your to-do list.
Oh, that's so true.
Just like trying to fill a leaky bucket,
Yeah.
you're pouring in the self-care, but it's not really solving the underlying problem. Yeah, and so she's saying that, actually setting boundaries is a deeper form of self-care because you're addressing the root cause. You're protecting your time, your energy, your emotional well-being.
So instead of just treating the symptoms, you're actually addressing like the root cause of the problem.
Exactly.
But before we get too deep into the how of setting boundaries, let's talk about the what.
Yeah.
And Tawwab actually outlines 6 types of boundaries, and those are physical, sexual, intellectual, emotional, material, and time.
It's kind of a long list.
It is a long list, but she makes it clear that all of these actually play a role in us creating a sense of peace and well-being in our own lives.
Yeah, well, let's not just like list them out. I think we can talk about some of them, right? Let's imagine you have a friend, okay? And they borrow money, but they never pay you back. Like that's a classic example of a material boundary issue.
Oh, I have been there.
Right.
You want to be supportive, but then like the resentment builds up, and that can really damage the friendship.
Exactly. And or like imagine you're in a relationship and your partner is constantly like checking your phone or like trying to control who you hang out with. That's a red flag. Those are like physical and emotional boundaries being crossed.
Yeah, those emotional ones are so tricky. I feel like a lot of people struggle with those, especially in those close relationships. Where do you draw the line between being supportive and feeling like you're just being totally drained by someone else's emotional baggage?
Right. It's so hard.
It's tough.
It is tough. And that's where, she gives you really helpful frameworks for figuring that out.
Right.
She talks about being compassionate but firm and setting limits without, just shutting down the relationship entirely.
Right. So it's not about cutting people off completely. It's about like finding that healthy, sustainable connection.
Exactly.
But let's get back to those 6 types of boundaries that we were talking about.
Yeah.
I think it is really helpful to understand like the range of areas where boundaries come into play in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've covered material and emotional, but let's talk about a few more. So, think about intellectual boundaries, right? Those are all about respecting each other's thoughts and opinions, even when you disagree.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays where, everyone's got an opinion and a platform to share it on.
Right.
It's about engaging in healthy debate without feeling like you're being attacked or like completely dismissed.
Exactly. And then there are like sexual boundaries, right? Those are all about, consent and comfort and respecting each other's limits. And what's great about her book is that she really emphasizes that these are so personal and they can evolve over time.
Right. And then let's not forget time, which is arguably our most precious resource. It's about protecting that time, making conscious choices about how we spend our days.
Mm.
Saying no to commitments that just drain us or don't align with our priorities.
Exactly. And let's not forget about physical boundaries,
Yeah.
Those are all about our personal space, like and how comfortable we are with um touch, and it can be anything, like from setting limits on hugging to feeling comfortable saying no to unwanted physical contact.
Okay, so we have this like menu of boundaries, and it's clear that they're important in all these areas of our life. But here's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
How do you actually set those boundaries without feeling like a jerk?
That's the question, right?
Yeah, how do you do it? Because it's so hard.
It's hard, and this is like where she really shines. She gives really specific advice about how to do it, like scripts and strategies for communicating boundaries, even in tricky situations.
Ooh, okay, lay it on us. What's the secret sauce?
One of the biggest things is to use I statements, right?
Yeah.
So instead of saying like you're always late,
Right.
you could say I feel disrespected when you don't show up on time.
Okay, so it's about focusing on your own experience rather than blaming the other person.
Exactly. And it's also about being direct, without being aggressive. And she gives this great framework. I want, I need, I don't.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Super simple, but powerful for like setting a boundary.
It's clear and concise. Okay, so I'm starting to see how this works. But what about those people who like just don't get it? The ones that like keep pushing your boundaries even after you've communicated like so clearly.
Yeah. That's where the action comes in.
Okay.
And sometimes that involves setting some consequences.
Oh, okay. Like what kind of consequences?
It depends on the situation.
Right, sure.
But, it could be like limiting contact, ending the relationship, or, in really extreme cases, even taking legal action.
Right, because sometimes you got to protect yourself,
Exactly.
even if it means like hurting somebody else's feelings.
Right. And the thing is, you're not responsible for other people's reactions. You can only control your own actions.
Okay, that's a tough lesson, but it's an important one.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about setting boundaries with ourselves.
Ooh, yes.
Because, she really emphasizes in the book that these self-boundaries are just as important as the boundaries that we set with others.
Totally. It's like the foundation of it all.
Right. But, like, what does that actually look like?
Mm.
What does that actually look like in our everyday lives?
Yeah. So, like, think about the areas where you sabotage yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe you're constantly overcommitting or spending money that you don't have, or, staying up late scrolling social media even though you should be sleeping.
Oh, guilty.
Right. We all do it. But the thing is, setting boundaries with yourself is really about treating yourself with the same respect and kindness that you would offer to anybody else.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that you deserve to be cared for just as much as anybody else.
So it's about creating those healthy habits and routines that actually, like, support your overall well-being.
Exactly. It could be like, setting limits on your screen time, prioritizing sleep, making time for exercise or creative pursuits, even just saying no to that extra glass of wine or that late night snack that you shouldn't be having.
Okay, so those self-boundaries are all about those, like, everyday choices that add up over time and ultimately really shape, like, our lives.
Totally.
But here's another question. How do you actually stay consistent with all of these boundaries, both the ones with yourself and the ones that you set with other people?
It's so hard.
It's so hard. It's like the hardest part, I think.
It is, and there's no magic bullet, but honestly, like one thing that's really helpful is to make them visible.
Okay, wait, what does that mean?
It could be as simple as like writing down your boundaries, and putting them somewhere you'll see them, like on your bathroom mirror or your fridge.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Or like, if you're trying to like set limits on your phone time, maybe you put your phone in a drawer for a couple hours a day, or, make like a phone-free zone in your house.
No, right.
Or-
Yeah, it's like those little reminders to keep you on track, especially when those old habits start to creep back in.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our boundaries defined. We've practiced our I statements. We've even got those visual cues to help us stay consistent. But what about those moments when our boundaries are tested? Because let's be real, it's not always going to be smooth sailing.
No, it's not. And that's where the real work begins.
Okay, so what can we expect? And how can we prepare ourselves for those inevitable challenges?
Well, first of all, you just have to be prepared for some pushback. Yeah, people don't always like it when you set boundaries with them.
Right, and I think it's important to understand, like, the different ways those boundaries can be tested.
Yeah, and Tawwab talks about like um, macro and micro violations.
Okay, I love those terms.
Right.
Let's break them down. So what's a macro violation?
So those are like the big ones. Like imagine a coworker taking credit for your work or a family member like constantly pressuring you to make choices that, just don't align with your values. Those are pretty obvious boundary crossings.
Right, those are the big ones.
The big ones.
What about micro violations? Those are a little sneakier.
Yeah, those are like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Oh, I love that.
Like individually they might seem small, but over time they can really like erode your self-worth and make you feel like off.
Ooh. Yeah. That's a really powerful image. Can you give me some like concrete examples of those micro violations? Because I think, a lot of people might be experiencing these without even realizing it.
Totally. Think about like a friend who constantly interrupts you when you're talking.
Oh, yes.
Or like a partner who like makes these like subtle hurtful jokes about your appearance.
Yes, those little digs.
Yes.
Those little digs.
The little digs that make you feel bad, but you're like, did they really mean it that way?
Yeah, like you don't even know if you can be upset or not.
Exactly. Or like a family member who always gives you advice that you didn't ask for.
Oh, yes. Unsolicited advice?
Unsolicited advice, even though, you're perfectly capable of making your own decisions.
Right. So those micro violations are all about those little things that chip away at your sense of self and your right to actually set boundaries.
Yeah, but how do you know? Like, how do you know if it's actually a boundary violation or if you're just being, like, overly sensitive?
Yeah, this is like the question, right?
It is.
It's so hard to know sometimes. But I think, like, ultimately you have to trust your gut.
Okay.
If you feel uncomfortable or drained or, resentful after interacting with someone, that's a pretty good indicator that something's not right.
Like your internal alarm system's going off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm.
And also, like, if you find yourself making excuses for someone's behavior,
Ooh.
like, oh, they didn't mean it that way, or they're just going through a tough time, that's a sign. Right. That you're letting those violations slide.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if they didn't intend to hurt you.
Right.
Their actions are still having a negative impact.
Yeah.
And it's your responsibility to protect yourself.
Yes. Okay, so we're tuning into those signs that our boundaries are being tested. But let's talk about some of the scenarios that Tawwab covers in the book.
Yeah.
She talks about this term, and I love this term, enmeshment.
Oh, yeah.
What does that actually mean?
So, like, enmeshment is kind of like, when you have, like, a tangled ball of yarn?
Okay.
It's like those individual strands are like the people, and they're all so intertwined, it's hard to tell where one person ends and the other person begins. It often happens in families where, like, emotional boundaries are really blurred and people feel like they're responsible for each other's feelings.
Okay, so it's like an extreme lack of boundaries
Yes.
where everyone's so tangled up, it's like hard to breathe.
Exactly. Exactly. And, it can be, like, really damaging for kids growing up in these environments because they never learn to develop a sense of self.
Right, like they never get that space to just, like, be themselves.
Yeah. And it can show up in different ways. Sometimes it's like oversharing personal information or making decisions for other people without their consent, or like even feeling responsible for other people's happiness.
Ooh, those are some heavy dynamics. Okay, let's move on to another boundary issue that Tawwab addresses in the book, and that's codependency.
Oh, yes, codependency.
And this one feels like particularly relevant to our culture that like glorifies self-sacrifice.
It does. It's like it's often presented as like, oh, you're such a caring person or you're so supportive.
Right, yeah.
But it can be really damaging, to both people involved.
Right.
It's like a dance, right? One person is constantly giving, the other person is constantly taking, and neither person is truly able to like stand on their own 2 feet.
So it's not about genuine support. It's about like this unhealthy dynamic where one person's sense of self-worth is tied to their ability to fix or rescue the other person.
Exactly. And it can show up in all sorts of relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, family dynamics, even at work. And the key sign is that, one person is constantly prioritizing the other person's needs, often at the expense of their own.
And that leads to resentment and burnout.
Resentment, burnout, you lose yourself.
Yeah, you lose yourself.
Yeah.
Let's talk about another boundary violation I think a lot of people struggle with, manipulation.
Ooh, yes.
And this is, just kind of those sneaky tactics to control or influence somebody. It's about getting your needs met, but not, directly.
Right, without asking. Or, respecting the other person's right to say no.
Right, and it can be so confusing because it leaves you feeling guilty or like doubting your own perceptions of what's actually happening.
Totally, totally. And it looks different for everyone, but like some of the signs are, the guilt trips, like the after all I've done for you.
Oh yeah, the
The
classic like, oh,
classics, or like playing the victim, making threats,
right, right.
or even, using passive aggressive behavior.
Ooh, that's a sneaky one.
Yeah.
And it can be so subtle, right? It's not always easy to spot.
It's not. It's not, and that's why it's important to like really pay attention to those gut feelings if something feels off.
Yeah, trust your gut.
Trust your gut. If you feel like you're being pressured or coerced into doing something you don't want to do, red flag.
Yes, red flag. Okay, so let's talk about some more like everyday examples of boundary violations, like those situations that we might encounter on a regular basis. Tawwab talks about physical boundaries.
Hmm.
And, these can be kind of tricky to navigate, especially in a culture where we're, pretty touchy-feely.
We are. And this is all about respecting personal space. Like it could be, someone standing too close to you when they're talking to you or touching you without asking, or even like commenting on your appearance in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable.
Yes, it's about honoring that like invisible bubble that we all have, even if we're not like conscious of it all the time.
Exactly, exactly. And it's about having the right to say no to any type of touch that just doesn't feel good to you, even if it's, from someone you love.
Okay, so physical boundaries, respecting that personal space. What about emotional boundaries? Those can feel a little more like, amorphous.
Yeah, they are a little harder to define, but they're all about protecting your emotional well-being. It's about like setting limits on, how much you're willing to share, how much you're willing to take on, who you let into that inner circle.
So it's about creating that safe space where you can be vulnerable and you can be authentic without feeling like you're going to be, judged or criticized or overwhelmed by someone else's emotions.
Exactly, exactly. And those emotional boundary violations can happen in so many ways. It could be like that friend who's always dumping their problems on you, but, never seems to want to listen to yours, or, a partner who's trying to like control your emotions,
Oh,
or
yeah.
like a family member who constantly criticizes you.
It's so common. It's so painful. And I think a lot of people really struggle to set those boundaries because, they don't want to come across as, like uncaring or they don't want to hurt the other person's feelings.
Totally, totally. But it's not about being mean. It's really about, taking care of yourself.
Right.
It's about self-respect.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So how do you actually set those emotional boundaries in a way that feels compassionate but also firm?
So one thing you can do is just start by, naming your feelings. You could say something like, I love you, I want to be supportive, but feeling a little overwhelmed right now. Can we talk about this later? Or I understand you're going through a tough time, but I'm not really the right person to give you the support you need right now. Maybe you could talk to like a therapist.
Right. You're acknowledging their feelings, but you're also being really clear about your own limits.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And sometimes setting those emotional boundaries might involve like creating some distance,
Yeah.
limiting contact or even ending the relationship.
Right, right, right. Okay, those are tough choices. But sometimes they're necessary to protect like your emotional well-being. Before we move on to the next section, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, and that was those micro violations, those little digs or those little comments that can like really chip away at your self-esteem.
Mm.
How do you address those without sounding like you're, like overreacting?
It's a good question. And it's hard, right? Like, how do you find that balance? But you don't always have to like be confrontational to set a boundary.
Okay.
Sometimes just changing the subject or redirecting the conversation is enough.
Oh, okay. So give me an example. So let's say you've got a coworker and they're always like making those little jokes at your expense.
You could say something like, oh, you're so funny. Have you seen that new show that everyone's talking about?
Yeah.
Or you can just like acknowledge it without really engaging,
Right.
Oh, interesting point, and then move on.
Yeah, you're shifting the focus
Exactly.
without like calling them out necessarily.
Yeah, and sometimes, those subtle shifts are enough, but if it keeps happening, then you might have to have a more direct conversation.
Right, right, right. And when that happens, Tawwab recommends using like, those I statements to express how their behavior is actually making you feel.
Hmm. Exactly. So instead of saying, you're always putting me down, you could say, I feel hurt and disrespected when you make those kinds of jokes.
Okay, so you're owning your feelings without blaming the other person.
Exactly. And remember, you are allowed to have boundaries. It's not selfish. You deserve to be treated with respect, even in those small interactions.
Yes, yes, you're so right. Okay, so we've talked about recognizing boundary violations, those macro, micro ones. We've talked about how to communicate boundaries, but now let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Hmm.
How do you actually set those boundaries in a practical sense? Because it's one thing to say, I need more space, but it's another thing to actually create that space.
It is. And that's where so many people get stuck. They know they need boundaries, but they don't know how to actually do it.
Yeah, so let's get practical. What are some of those actionable steps?
So one of the biggest things is to start small.
Okay.
You don't have to do everything at once.
Right, don't overhaul everything overnight.
Yeah, it can be really overwhelming, and it might even backfire if you try to do too much too soon. So think about one area of your life where you feel like your boundaries are being crossed, and focus on one or two boundaries in that area.
Okay, that's manageable. So, for example, let's say I'm struggling with that friend who's always, you know, dumping their problems on me, but never seems to want to listen to mine. What's a small boundary I could start with?
So, maybe you could limit the amount of time you spend talking to them on the phone. So instead of letting those conversations go on for an hour, maybe set a timer for 20 minutes.
Okay, that's a good one. It's subtle.
It is. It is. And it's a way to start creating space, without having to have this big confrontation.
Right. What are some other practical tips?
It's also helpful to practice your boundary statements in advance.
Oh, that's good.
Right, because in the heat of the moment, it can be so hard to, articulate what you need.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So write it down.
Write it down, yeah. Or, even role play it with a friend,
Well, that's a good idea.
just to get comfortable with what you want to say. Another thing that's really important is to be consistent.
Ooh, consistency is key.
Consistency is key. Once you set a boundary, you got to stick to it.
Right, you got to follow through.
You got to follow through, yeah. And it's also important to be direct and assertive, but in a way that's not, aggressive.
Right, so how do you do that? How do you find that sweet spot?
It's really about, using those I statements. It's about, focusing on your needs. It's not about blaming the other person. So instead of saying, you're always late, you could say, I feel disrespected when you don't show up on time.
Right, you're communicating your feelings,
Yeah.
in a clear way, but it's respectful.
Exactly. And remember, you are allowed to have these boundaries. It's not selfish to protect your time, your energy, all of it.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm really getting this. Boundaries are not selfish. They're about self-respect.
Yes.
But what about those people who just don't seem to get it? The ones that just keep pushing and pushing, even after you've, communicated really clearly what your boundaries are.
Yeah, that's where the tough stuff comes in.
Okay.
And sometimes it might involve setting consequences.
Okay, what does that look like? What kind of consequences?
Well, it depends on the situation, of course. But it might look like, limiting contact or ending the relationship or, in extreme cases, even taking legal action.
Right, because sometimes you have to protect yourself,
You do.
even if it means hurting someone else's feelings.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that you're not responsible for other people's reactions, You can only control your own actions.
You can't control other people, just yourself.
Yeah.
That is such a difficult but important lesson. Before we move on to the final section, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Tawwab talks about, setting boundaries. It's not just about saying no. It's also about saying yes to the things that matter most to you. What does that mean for you?
It's such a good point, and it's really about why boundaries are so empowering, because you're not just creating limits, you're actually creating space
Oh, yeah.
for the things that bring you joy.
Right. It's like decluttering your life so you can make space for the good stuff.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's not just about saying no to those energy vampires and boundary violators. It's about saying yes to, spending time with people who lift you up. It's about, pursuing your passions, taking care of yourself.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it's really an act of self-love.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's not always easy. It takes courage. It takes practice. Sometimes it even takes a little discomfort.
Right.
But it's so worth it.
Okay, so we've covered so much in this section on setting boundaries, but there's one more piece of the puzzle that we need to address, and that is, What happens when those boundaries are tested?
Oh, yeah.
Because people aren't always going to be happy when we start setting those limits.
They're not. And that's where a lot of people get tripped up, right? They set a boundary and then they back down at the first sign of
It
resistance.
can be really uncomfortable.
It can. But if you don't enforce your boundaries, they're not really boundaries.
There's just suggestions at that point.
There's just suggestions, yeah. So how do you stay strong when those boundaries are being tested?
Right. Because I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling of like wanting to cave under pressure.
Totally. So the first thing is to just like remember why you set the boundary in the first place.
Okay.
Like, what was the purpose?
What were you hoping to achieve?
Yeah. And when you are clear about your motivation, it makes it so much easier to like actually stand your ground.
Right.
And another helpful tip is to like kind of try to anticipate those tricky reactions. Think about how the other person might respond and then like prepare yourself, kind of practice what you might say.
Well, that's good, like having a script in your head.
Exactly.
So you're not caught off guard.
Yeah. And and remember, you don't have to engage in a debate. You don't have to justify your boundaries. You can just, state them calmly and firmly, and that's it.
Right. It's not about winning an argument.
It's not.
It's about, like, protecting yourself.
Exactly. And sometimes, like, enforcing your boundaries might involve creating some distance or limiting contact or even, ending the relationship.
Right. Those are tough choices,
They are.
but sometimes necessary.
It's sometimes necessary.
Okay, so let's talk about some specific reactions that people might have when their boundaries are tested.
Mm-hmm.
Because Tawwab mentions a few in the book that I think are really, really common, and that is defensiveness, guilt trips, and the silent treatment. So let's start with defensiveness. How do you deal with someone who gets defensive when you set a boundary?
It's so common, right? Especially if someone's not used to you setting boundaries with them. They might try to justify their actions or, make excuses or even like turn around, blame you. Like, you're being too sensitive. Yeah. So it's like their ego is flattened.
Right, yeah.
And they're trying to like deflect.
Right.
So, in those situations, it's really important to just stay calm and not get sucked in.
Okay, so how do you do that? So let's say, for example, you set a boundary with a friend and they're always canceling plans at the last minute and they get defensive and they say you're being unreasonable.
Right. You could say something like, I hear that you're frustrated and I understand that things come up sometimes, but it's important for me to feel like my time is valued and it hurts my feelings when our plans are constantly changing. So going forward, I would really appreciate it if you could make more of an effort to honor our commitments.
Okay, so you're acknowledging their feelings, but you're also being really firm in like what your boundary is.
Yeah.
Okay, what about guilt trips? Because, some people are masters at using guilt to manipulate others into doing what they want.
Oh, they are.
They are.
They are. And guilt trips are like a classic way to make you feel bad for setting boundaries. So, they might say things like, after all I've done for you, or you're going to hurt my feelings if you do this.
Oh, the classics. Ugh. How do you not get sucked into that vortex of guilt?
It's tough.
That's hard.
It's hard, but like the key is to remember that, you are not responsible for other people's feelings.
Right.
You can acknowledge their feelings without, giving into their demands. So you can say something like, I hear that you're disappointed and I understand that this might be an adjustment, but, this is what I need.
Yeah, you're separating your needs from like their emotional reaction.
Exactly. And it can be helpful to remember that guilt is often a tactic that people use when, like, they don't really have a good argument.
Right.
Or, they just don't want to respect your boundary.
Yeah, they're not willing to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guilt trips. Manipulation.
Yeah.
What about the silent treatment?
Ooh, yeah.
This one is so painful because it's just like this wall of silence.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate passive-aggressive tactic.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. What's the best way to handle that? Because it is so tempting to just give in and apologize just to get them to talk to you again.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they want you to do.
Yeah.
Right? But the most important thing is to not cave.
Oh.
You can't let them manipulate you into retracting your boundary.
So resist that urge to, like, try to fix it.
Resist. You can try reaching out once or twice. You can express how it's making you feel. But if they're not budging, you just have to let them be.
Okay. Wow, that's tough.
It's tough. But, you can't force someone to communicate if they don't want to.
Okay, so we've talked about some common reactions. Defensiveness, guilt trips, the silent treatment. Let's get real. What if someone just flat out refuses to respect your boundaries? They just keep pushing no matter what you do.
It happens.
It does happen. It does.
And honestly, sometimes the healthiest choice is to just like step back, create some distance or even walk away from that relationship.
Right, because you can't control other people's behavior. You can only control your own. You
Yeah.
can't force someone to respect you.
You can. And ultimately, you are responsible for your own well-being. Sometimes that means making tough choices about, who you let into your life.
Okay, so sometimes walking away
Mm.
is the answer, especially if someone's, repeatedly violating your boundaries.
Yeah.
But what about those relationships that you want to salvage? The ones that are really important to you, even if they're messy. Um, Tawwab talks about setting boundaries with compassion, even when it's hard.
It's the best way to do it.
Yeah, what does that actually look like in a practical sense?
So, it means approaching the conversation with, empathy and understanding.
Oh.
It means, trying to see their perspective, even if you don't agree with them. And it means being willing to, compromise sometimes,
Okay.
but, not on your core values and needs.
Okay, so give me an example. So let's say you're setting a boundary with a family member, and they're always giving you, unsolicited advice.
Yeah.
And, they're coming from a good place, but it feels intrusive.
Yeah, you could say something like, I know that you care about me and I appreciate your advice,
Hmm.
but I really need to make my own decisions, even if I make mistakes. It's really important for me to learn and grow from my own experiences.
So you're validating their intentions, but you're being firm about your need for autonomy.
Exactly. And remember, setting boundaries with compassion doesn't mean being a doormat.
Right.
Right.
It's finding that balance.
It's finding that balance.
Yeah. It's not an either situation.
It's not. It's about both people feeling heard and respected.
I love that.
Okay.
Yeah. So sometimes, that might mean having those tough conversations, maybe negotiating those boundaries, being willing to walk away if the other person's not, willing to meet you halfway.
Exactly.
Because healthy relationships require that mutual respect.
They do. And, sometimes the people who push back the hardest are the ones who need boundaries the most.
Oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because those are the people who are used to getting their way.
Oh, right.
They might be used to, controlling other people or having their needs met at the expense of, everybody else.
Right.
So when you start setting boundaries, you're disrupting that dynamic.
Right. You're shaking things up a little bit.
Exactly. And that can be really unsettling.
Okay.
But it's also an opportunity for growth.
Right.
For both people.
Yeah, everybody can level up. Okay, so we've talked about reframing that rejection, recognizing that it's often a sign of incompatibility.
Okay.
And understanding that those people who push back the hardest, maybe they need boundaries the most. But before we move on to the final section, I want to circle back to something that the Tawwab emphasizes throughout the book, the connection between boundaries and self-worth.
It's huge.
Yes.
It's at the core of it all.
Right, because it's not just about setting those limits, it's about believing that you are actually worthy of those limits.
Yes. And so many people struggle with that. They might know, intellectually, yeah, I deserve to be treated with respect, but they don't feel it.
Right.
So
it makes it really hard to set those boundaries.
Yeah.
Because, you don't feel like you have a right to ask for what you need.
Exactly. And so, so much of her work is about helping people cultivate that sense of self-worth. And she gives, all these amazing exercises and practices for doing that.
Okay, let's talk about that. What are some of those practices? Because I think a lot of people might be listening and thinking, yeah, I know I need boundaries, but I don't even know where to start with self-worth.
So one thing you can do is just become aware of, your negative self-talk.
Oh, okay.
What are those voices in your head saying, and where did those messages come from?
Right, because often those negative beliefs come from, past experiences,
Yeah.
whether it's childhood stuff or, societal conditioning or even just hurtful comments that people have said to us.
Exactly. And once you can kind of identify those beliefs, you can start to challenge them. Ask yourself, is this really true? Or what evidence do I have to support this?
Right, so it's about becoming a detective of your own thoughts.
Totally. And then, you can start to replace those negative beliefs with more positive and empowering ones. And this is where affirmations can be really helpful.
Ooh, yeah. I love affirmations. What are some good ones for building self-worth?
Some, like, classic ones are, I am worthy of love and respect.
Oh, yeah.
I am capable of achieving my goals. I am enough.
Yes, yes.
It's about understanding that when you set boundaries, you're not just protecting yourself, you're actually creating space for something new.
Right. So it's not just about like, shutting things out. It's about opening ourselves up to something better.
Exactly. And it's amazing how when you start setting boundaries in one area of your life, it can have this ripple effect.
Okay, so like how does that work? It feels like we're talking about like more than just those individual interactions, like a shift in our overall energy.
Yeah, think about it. When you start setting boundaries, they're taking back your power.
Okay.
You're saying no to the things that drain you and yes to the things that you actually care about.
Right.
You're making choices that are aligned with what you want. And that energy, it's contagious.
Oh.
Like when you start putting yourself first, other people notice that. And it gives them permission to do the same.
Oh, I love that. So it's not just about changing your own life. It's about like inspiring change in the world around you.
Totally.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And it's not always easy, It takes courage, it takes practice,
Right.
but the payoff is huge.
Okay, so we've covered so much in this deep dive, the different types of boundaries, how to recognize when they're being crossed, how to communicate them, how to deal with those tricky reactions, and what to expect once we actually set them. But before we wrap up, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Tawwab ends the book by saying, boundaries aren't just about setting limits, they're about creating freedom.
Yes.
What does that mean for you?
Freedom to be ourselves, freedom to live a life that feels good to us and have relationships that actually, feel supportive.
Right, because when we have healthy boundaries, we're not giving our power away
Yeah.
to other people, to those old patterns.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people think about boundaries like as being restrictive, but actually it's the opposite.
Oh, okay.
When you have boundaries, you know where you stand, you know what you're okay with, and you're free to make choices that, feel right to you.
But how do boundaries create freedom in our relationships? Because it feels counterintuitive, right?
Right.
Like setting limits would actually create more restrictions.
Yeah, well, think about it this way. When you have boundaries, you're not like walking on eggshells all the time.
Okay.
You're not afraid to speak up, to say what you need, to set limits on behaviors that just don't feel good to you. You're not carrying everyone else's baggage.
So it's about creating that safe space where you can really be yourself.
Yes.
Without that fear of judgment or rejection.
Exactly.
You're free to be authentic.
You are.
I love that. And when you feel safe, you're more open.
You are.
You're more vulnerable.
Yes.
So those boundaries actually create like a deeper connection.
Deeper connection.
Because you know that your needs are going to be respected.
You do. And what's really freeing?
What's that?
Is that you don't have to control anyone else. You can't control how other people behave, but you can control how you react.
Okay. And sometimes that means walking away. Right.
Sometimes it can be painful.
It is. But ultimately, it's about choosing freedom.
Yes.
Choosing authenticity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even if someone rejects your boundaries, that doesn't mean you failed.
Okay.
It just means that, maybe they weren't the right person for you.
That incompatibility.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the world of boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the most important takeaways? What are those nuggets of wisdom that our listeners can take with them as they kind of embark on this journey?
Okay, so first of all, remember, you are worthy of boundaries.
Yes, you are.
You deserve to be treated with respect. You have a right to ask for what you need. It's not selfish to take care of yourself. Actually, it's essential.
Okay, what else?
Boundaries are not about controlling other people. They're about taking control of your own life.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
What else?
Setting boundaries is a process,
Yeah.
It takes time, it takes practice, it takes patience. Don't be afraid to, mess up along the way.
It's a learning curve.
It is. Communicate your boundaries clearly,
Okay.
Be direct. Use those I statements. Repeat yourself if you need to.
Right, because people can't read our minds, unfortunately.
You can't. Be consistent.
Okay.
Once you set a boundary, stick to it.
Okay, and finally, remember, setting boundaries is not about closing yourself off. It's actually about opening yourself up
It is.
to those more authentic, more fulfilling connections.
It is.
Yeah, it's about creating that space where you can be yourself
Yeah.
and inviting others to do the same.
Beautifully said. And even those small changes,
Yeah.
they can make a huge difference. So pick one boundary you want to work on and just try it.
That's great advice. Well, to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into boundaries. We hope you found it helpful and empowering.
We did.
And remember, you're worthy of healthy relationships, both with yourself and others. So go out there and set those boundaries.
Until next time.